Welcome back. In this series, I've been telling the story of my Bohemian-German ancestors' 200-year trek across continents and oceans to become homesteaders in the Canadian West at the turn of the 20th century. By 1916, German-speaking immigrants from Eastern Europe constituted the third largest language group in Saskatchewan. My generation spoke English, and we scarcely noticed and understood little of our elders' conversations in German, likely no more than children of our Polish, Hungarian, and Ukrainian neighbors noticed their bilingualism. We lived in little language islands, similar to our ancestors in Fleetsiental and its sister villages in Galicia, and for our elders there were more parallels. Isolated, rural, without modern utilities and technologies, their early days in Saskatchewan were not substantially different from their 19th century lives in Europe. However, as minorities, our ancestors had always spoken the official language of government and practiced the state religion, Catholicism. Whereas in Canada, the official language was English, and German speakers, as well as the Poles, Ukrainians, and Hungarians, were surrounded by a sea of English Protestants. Of course, all settlers understood this fact, and many from our family had already taken evening English classes in Winnipeg before claiming their homesteads. That my great-grandparents, Ferdinand and Katharina, never learned more than a few English words or phrases belied the fact that they wanted their children and grandchildren to speak English. And for that, they'd need a school. And so it was, on December 20th, 1906, just 7 months after our elders arrived in their homesteads, they had arranged a meeting to petition for a school. The meeting was most likely conducted entirely in German, though, since most who attended, look at this, Müller, Säuberlich, Pfeiffer, Kreutzer, Hofmeister, and Lang, spoke minimal English at best. Apparently, someone suggested the school be named Karlsruhe, after a city in Germany, but the consensus settled on Wallenstein, from Albrecht von Wallenstein, a 16th century German Bohemian who became the supreme military commander of the entire Holy Roman Empire. I attended Wallenstein School for 6 years, and I recall hearing nothing about old Wallenstein. But then I sometimes can't recall what I had for breakfast. Never mind. When the school founders voted for trustees, great-grandfather Ferdinand did not vote for his own son John. One imagines the conversation was thin on the walk home that day, but who knows? The petition was accepted, a school built, and the first teacher, Karl Kaufmann, was hired for the princely sum of $50 per month, paid for by a school tax of $10 per quarter section, or 6 cents per acre. Not every settler was an East European. For example, homesteaders Whitlock, Greenaway, Pearson, and McAfee. And although they did not constitute the majority of the population in 1908, English Canadians were very much in charge of the big picture and the railroads. The Grand Trunk inched its way across Canada in the early 1900s, roughly parallel to the Canadian Pacific Railway, which was completed in 1885. West of Winnipeg, the Grand Trunk chose a route north of the CPR, arriving at the newly homesteaded prairies around the Touchwood Hills in 1907. Along its length, sites for villages were chosen every 10 miles or so, allowing a reasonable access for local farmers to deliver their grain for shipment by train. Elevators were constructed at each stop, an ubiquitous sight on the prairies. Elevators because the grain was elevated to the top of these structures so that the grain cars below could be filled by gravity alone. Each elevator proudly proclaimed the name of its village, and, for reasons never fully explained, these villages were named alphabetically. Beginning with A in Arona, Manitoba, eventually the namers ran through the alphabet 4 times. Our alphabet began with Atwater, Bangor, Canna, through Ituna, Jasmine, Kelleher, and Lestock to Punishai, one of the few stops named for an indigenous word meaning fledgling bird. Then Quinton, source unknown, and also the name of a fictional character in a fictional Saskatchewan town, and Raymore, supposedly named for a non-fictional railroad employee. The CPR and Grand Trunk were not just railway companies, they were also massive landowners, granted 28 million acres of Crown land as partial payment for building the railroads. In Saskatchewan, they owned all odd-numbered sections for 24 miles on either side of the railroad, except for 11 and 29. This land was eventually sold to settlers by the railroad's agency, the Land and Agricultural Company of Canada. As rail lines were built, locals were hired along the way. William Cowth, one of the earliest settlers in the Quinton area, reported that when the railroad crew was approaching Quinton in 1907, they camped on his father's homestead. John Lang's neighbors, John Holterman and Herman Hilleman, signed on as cooks, while Joe Lawrence, Bill Bannock, Steve Zeller, and a Mr. Bagginstosh worked construction. In early 1908, before the railroad crews arrived in what would become Raymore, a general merchant named A.G. McLean and a pharmacist, Mr. H.E. Martin, were already set up and doing business. From a handful of initial residents, including Richard Watt, Hedley and Charles Frost, and Wilfred Jones, within a few months the population surged to 100 souls, the minimum required to be proclaimed a village. Archie McLean championed the application, with his offices serving as a meeting place. Signatories to the petition were 3 merchants, 1 restaurateur, a druggist, a barber and pool room keeper, and note the co-location of those 2, a baker, a well borer, and 1 farmer, A. Linford. J.W. Partridge was elected overseer, and H.E. Martin, described as a responsible person, was appointed as the first secretary-treasurer. The railroad changed everything. In a matter of months, bald prairie gave way to thriving villages. Trains brought farm equipment and supplies, household goods, and lumber, some of which was used to build Raymore's sidewalks, for which it was modestly famous, it seems, and necessary, given the streets would have been a pungent mix of mud and horse manure. By 1910, Raymore boasted a 3-story hotel, which stands to this day, minus the top floor, and yes, there's a story there for another time. (1911 and 1912) saw a bustling main street lined with businesses, one owned by Jim Tate, who was not shy about his name, it seems. For reasons unknown, he posed for a photo with an S.L. Trotsky, a name we'll meet again, and Kawakatu's chief Tawequisquape, which means middle of the sky, who held that position for 50 years, and one of his counselors on the far right. Most of our family was staunchly Catholic, and itching for a real church to replace services at Wallenstein. And the new missionary priest, Father Schulte, agreed and ordered a church to be built. A Mr. Rottweiler framed it, and Ferdinand's son, John Lang, finished it. Total cost, $600. Catholics were not alone in their religious fervor. In 1911, equally devout Anglicans built St. Martin's Church, and surprisingly, Presbyterians, Methodists, and Catholics were among those who helped pay for it. You don't see that kind of thing these days, do you? Yet more churches appeared, Baptist, United, and in Sarath, Lutheran. The latter served a number of German speakers who were from Germany proper, unlike our group. Homesteaders welcomed the arrival of lumber. In no time, frame houses replaced sod huts, and full-sized barns replaced crude shelters for livestock. And they constructed these buildings at the same time as they continued to break more prairie and increase their herds of cattle and horses. More horses meant bigger implements and faster plowing. Grandparents Max and Teresia settled on their quarter in 1909, and in the first year, using 4 oxen and 4 horses, they broke and cropped 30 acres. In the following year, they had added 2 more cows, 4 more horses, and had cropped 60 acres, built a barn, house, and granary, and had fenced 20 acres. I'm exhausted from merely imagining the work. Acreages grew, as did the settlers' families, and ours was no exception. Ferdinand and Katharina's children were having babies by the bushel, and in November 1909, my grandparents Max and Teresia had my father John, the first of their eventual 10 children. Apparently, no one told any of them to stop procreating, and 50 years later, this was Max and Teresia's family, which would grow to include 63 grandchildren. And 60 years after this photo was taken, most of us are now grandparents and great-grandparents. And that progeny sprang from just one child of Ferdinand and Katharina's 8 children. The math is daunting. And almost all of us owe our existence, in part, to yet another, believe it or not, unrelated Lang. In 1909, there were 2 local midwives, a Mrs. Dorr on Northwest 16, and a few miles northeast on Southeast 30, Teresa Wiedemann Lang, wife of Alois Lang, or Duchy Lang, a Hungarian. Teresa served as midwife for dozens of births over the years, including almost all of my father's siblings and cousins. For her fee, she is said to have accepted 2 bushels of seed grain. Her own large family included another John Lang, and one Gabriel Lang, who would marry my father's sister, Zita Lang, who was herself delivered by her mother-in-law-to-be. In a particularly odd twist, Zita once commented to me, "You know, my future husband was present in the room at my birth. How strange is that?" Pretty strange, but strange happened in those days when families were grouped together as they were, so Zita would become Zita Lang Lang, just as my mother would become Anne Lang Lang when she married her second cousin, my father, John Lang. Mom is not part of this video because her parents lived on a small dairy farm north of Winnipeg until moving to Saskatchewan in 1919. For now, my mother's story will have to wait. Laurier and Sifton were wise in choosing these Eastern European peasants to farm the prairies. They fled the old country in part because they were stuck on tiny acreages with no opportunity to get more. Although they had no experience farming such large tracts of land, when they were offered the opportunity, they grabbed these homesteads with both calloused hands. New implements appeared every year. The fertile land produced bumper crops, and by 1914 the Bohemian Sodbusters were buying Model Ts and Massey Harris binders. Their world was rosy indeed, and getting rosier, as wheat prices were soon to nearly double. You see, a war was brewing, and their old country would be smack dab in the middle of it. In addition to economic opportunities, our elders were eager to escape the constant threat of war and conscription in the old country. Ferdinand and Katharina's son John and their nephew Franz, my mother's father, were among many in the family to serve a mandatory 3-year term in the Austro-Hungarian army. Trouble had been brewing for years. At the turn of the century, Bohemian and Serbian anarchists, among others, were assassinating nobles and blowing up post offices in protest against their Austro-Hungarian overlords. European monarchs were caught in a tangle of protective alliances, and when a rebel Serb, Gavrilo Princip, pulled a pistol and assassinated Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the dominoes fell, and his shot launched the war to end all wars. In the next episode, we'll contrast the lives of our sodbuster ancestors in Saskatchewan with the other halves of their families who had remained in Europe, directly in the path of 2 massive opposing armies, when 1,200,000 Tsarist troops roared through western Galicia to do battle with a 900,000-strong Austro-Hungarian army. Until then, thanks for watching.